On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to take a look back at 2,000 years of church history. Gary Stearman has written an article for our March edition of Prophecy in the News magazine that is entitled Prophecy, Lost and Found. It's a fascinating story of what happened to prophecy after the apostolic age, the end of the first century, the death of the last apostle, and Jesus had not returned. How did the church feel? Gary Stearman is here to discuss that with me on today's program.
And today we're going to ask a question, which I ask in this article. Why was prophetic teaching pretty much abandoned in the second and third centuries of the Christian era? The answer to this question, J.R., is not only fundamental to our understanding of church history, it's fundamental to our understanding of prophecy itself. So stay with us because this is going to be an interesting program.
Now, you have written in your article, the first century prophetic plan of God simply disappeared. Israel was dispersed and thought lost forever. That's a fascinating view. Because we know that the Apostle Paul taught his people the imminency of Christ's return. In fact, it was as if he's coming back before I die. You know, I have a lot of people tell me today, I'm convinced that I'll be alive for the rapture. Well, the Apostle Paul was convinced that he would be alive for the rapture.
Yes.
In fact, the people in Thessalonica, and the church at Thessalonica, that is, were really frustrated because some of them were dying. So the Apostle Paul writes to them and he says, I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning them which are asleep. That is, your loved ones who you thought would be alive to see the return of Christ, and they have now died and passed on. He said, I want you to understand this. This is from the word of the Lord himself. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, you know. And he said, then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Gary, he believed sincerely that he was coming back before the end of the first century.
That's right. And to the Thessalonians, Paul wrote these words, 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 8 through 10. He compliments these people of Thessalonica. For from you sounded out the word of the Lord, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place your faith to Godward is spread abroad, so that we need not speak anything. These people were evangelistic, for they themselves show us what manner of entering in we had unto you, and how ye turned to God from idols, to serve the true, the living and true God. And, this is key right here, to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, even Jesus, which delivered us from the wrath to come. J.R., these people are living in the middle of the first century.
Yes.
And he tells them, your job is to evangelize. It is to wait for the Son from heaven prior to the coming wrath.
Isn't that amazing?
It is.
Now, you got to understand that this was the first New Testament book ever written. 1 Thessalonians was written before Matthew.
Yes.
Before Mark, before Luke, before the book of Acts. It was the first book written as early as perhaps AD 51. And already these people were saying, what about my cousin, my dad, my mom, my brother, my sister? They're dead. They died yesterday. What are we going to do? And the Apostle Paul says, here's the word from the Lord. He's coming. He's coming with a shout. Mm-hmm. He's going to raise the dead. So not to worry. And then, Gary, when he says that those people waited for his Son from heaven, and that when this comes, when Jesus comes to raise the dead, he's going to deliver us from the wrath to come. That's a pre-tribulation rapture there.
It is. And then, J.R., in 2 Thessalonians, he writes to the same group of people, and he says in 2 Thessalonians 2, 3 through 5, let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come. Now that day would be the day of Christ, the day of the Lord, the day of wrath, meaning you'll be delivered out before that day. That day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Now, J.R., the temple was still in full operation at this time.
Absolutely. That's very important to bring out here.
Yeah. Well, what this means is that the people receiving this letter could talk to each other in the next church meeting, and they would say, look at this letter Paul has written us. The temple over in Jerusalem, we know it's being occupied by people who are not necessarily the moral and ethical people that they should be. And it'd be just a hop, skip, and a jump until one of those people stood up and declared himself to be God. It could happen any day.
Well, Gary, James was over there in that temple praying every day.
That's right.
On his knees, till his knees were so callous they called them like camel's knees. And so these people were convinced that the Antichrist was going to come in their day.
Yes.
And when the temple was destroyed in AD 70, don't you know, it crushed the Christians. It just destroyed their hope. How can the Antichrist come and why hasn't Jesus come back? There had to be some doubt spring up there. John stayed around for another 30 years to assure them that Jesus was coming. And yet, you know, there's something happened to that early church after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem that just sort of put a crimp in the style of the prophetic teachings.
And we must add something else. This was the era of Claudius and Nero and Vespasian and Titus and Domitian.
Yes.
And J.R., with increasing severity as the decades rolled by, the church was being pummeled day in and day out. They had to go into hiding. And they're talking to each other and saying, well, the epistles of Paul tell us we've got to wait for the Son from heaven. He could come any time.
Yeah, and he's supposed to save us from the wrath to come.
Yes.
You know, why are we going through the tribulation period? I mean, this is really must have been what they were discussing. The Apostle John, in his first epistle, this is at least after AD 96, I think, he says, "These things have I written unto you concerning them that seduce you." In other words, there are people around with Antichrist seductions that were saying, where is the promise of his coming? For all things appear as they were from the beginning, you know. And Jude writes that in his epistle as well. So the frustration must have been there. And after John died, then things really sort of began to fall apart. Tell us, in your article, you've written about Clement of Rome. Tell us what he said.
Well, the fascinating thing is, and of course this is during the days of Domitian, who was a fiendish persecutor of the church. Clement of Rome died in AD 102. This means that he was a contemporary of the Apostle John. This is toward the end of the first century that he writes in 1 Clement 23, verses 2 through 5, which is a note of encouragement to the church at large. He says, "Wherefore let us not be double-minded, nor let our hearts form vain imaginations concerning his excellent and glorious gifts. Let not that scripture be applicable unto us, which saith, Wretched are the double-minded, even they that have doubt in their heart, and say, We have heard these things in the time of our fathers, and lo, we have grown old, and none of them hath happened unto us." Ooh, he's writing to a group of disgruntled, disappointed, doubters who are saying, we've grown old, and none of these prophecies have come true.
He is addressing a frustration.
Yes, he is.
A frustration that the early church had because the apostles were dying off and what they said wasn't coming to pass. He's coming, he's coming, he's coming. Look for him. He'll be here soon. Wait for him. And over and over and over again, they were disappointed. And so what does Clement say to them to do?
Well, he says, O foolish ones, compare yourselves to a tree. Take, for example, the vine. First it sheddeth its leaves, then cometh the bud, and then the leaf, then the flower, after that the unripe grape, and then the ripe grape. See how in a little time the fruit of the tree attaineth to maturity, of a truth, quickly, and suddenly shall his will be fulfilled. The scripture also bearing witness that he shall come quickly and shall not tarry, and the Lord shall come suddenly into his temple, even the Holy One whom ye expect. He's encouraging them, keep waiting for the Lord.
It's because he's coming quickly.
Yes.
He's coming suddenly. It won't be long now. Even
Right.
he was thinking that Jesus still, his coming was imminent.
Right.
That's what he's saying here. And it's just amazing to me that these guys believed in the imminent return of Christ and must have been sorely disappointed when each one of them came to die. They had to resign themselves to the fact that the Lord had not come back to save them and to establish the kingdom. Yeah. After their death, things really began to drift in that direction, that the Lord wasn't coming back.
Well, there were martyrdoms. In AD 107, Ignatius was martyred. In AD 108, the Emperor Trajan launched the third major wave of anti-Christian persecutions. Christian persecutions continued apace. And then there was a little period under Hadrian and Antoninus Pius, where after a while things kind of simmered down, and there was about a 40-year period in which churches were allowed to exist. However, it wasn't long after that there was another Roman persecution that came. And that one was under Marcus Aurelius. And by this time, the Christians had settled in to a kind of a patient waiting, thinking, well, surely he must come. But remember, J.R., the temple had been destroyed. That prophecy about Paul, about the man of sin written by Paul, standing in the temple, no longer had the immediacy that it did in the first century. They were thinking, well, the temple has to be rebuilt then before he could come and stand up in it. It's not even there now. Things must be a long way away. And they began to push back the coming of Christ. J.R., there was a man called Justin Martyr. Around 130 A.D., Justin began to write something. And by the way, this is from his dialogue with Trypho. He began to write something that reveals a change in thinking. In chapter 7 of his second apology, Justin writes, "Wherefore God delays causing the confusion and destruction of the whole world, by which the wicked angels and demons and men shall cease to exist, because the seed of the Christians who know that they are the cause of preservation in nature." He's beginning to say the reason for the existence of the church is to preserve the world and to better the world. And the idea implicit in this, and this is one of the first places you'll find this idea, which later becomes very prevalent in Augustine. Yes. The idea is that the church is to preserve the world and bring in the kingdom. It's an idea that began to steadily infuse the entire church.
Well, Jesus hadn't showed up yet.
That's right.
And so the theologians, even at mid-second century, and by the way, the interesting thing is, those who did not follow John's studies, the further away they were from John, who wrote the Apocalypse, and the further away they were in distance from Ephesus, the more non-prophetic they became, until they just actually set prophecy aside. Jesus didn't come back in the apostolic era, the turn of the century. When John died, somewhere around the turn of the century, prophecy just was not relevant anymore. And the Jews, in particular, this temple in Jerusalem, well, it's destroyed. And you know, in AD 132 through 135, under the Bar Kokhba revolt, when Hadrian, the Roman army, came in, they destroyed the city. He sowed salt. He plowed the city of Jerusalem and sowed salt in the furrows, and changed the name of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina, and changed the name of Israel to Palestine after Israel's ancient enemy, the Philistines. And the church looked at that and said, oh, the Jews are forever forsaken.
That's right.
They are no longer relevant. Evidently, all those promises in the Old Testament to the Jews are our promises. We have become the chosen people.
And JR, that's an important point because allegorical interpretation became fashionable, allegorizing Israel as the church. And we could say much about that, but I wanted at this point to mention Irenaeus, who lived from 130 to 202. And Irenaeus, in Against Heresies, wrote, and I've quoted a long passage here, which we don't have time to read, but essentially he says, and I'm reading the last few words, and God brought to a conclusion upon the sixth day the works that he had made, and God rested upon the seventh day from all his works. This an account of things formerly created, as also it is a prophecy of what is to come, for the day of the Lord is as 1,000 years, and in 6 days created things were completed. It is evident, therefore, that they will come to an end at the 6,000th year. Now, in so writing, he was stating a popular theory, but basically what he was doing was pushing back the time of Christ's coming to some point, and they weren't really decided about it. They didn't exactly know when the 6,000th year was, but at this point they were saying he's not coming soon.
That's true. They did not know that they had just crossed the threshold of the fourth millennium into the fifth millennium, because they didn't have the historical evidence. There weren't historians around. They didn't have great research staff and what have you. And history, especially Roman history, they changed their calendar so many times with every Caesar that came along. They had a different way of calculating. And it was not until many years later that all of this was able to be put back together and to see that Adam was created 4,004 years BC, essentially.
All they knew, JR, was that there would be a considerable length of time. And the job was no longer to watch and wait on a daily basis, but rather to live as the salt of the earth.
Yes, and look for the second coming maybe in another generation, somewhere down the road in the far distant future. And those poor folks at Thessalonica who thought he was coming imminently, and the poor Apostle Paul who thought the Antichrist was going to show up in the temple, and of course he died in 66 and the temple was destroyed 4 years later, and all of that just sort of fell apart. Poor folks, they just didn't really have it all together. They didn't quite understand it. But now we can see it better. It's clear. It looks like it'll be 6,000 years. And of course, he got that from John's teaching, even at the end of the first century. And so all of this was right, but it kind of magnified the problem until prophecy became irrelevant. It'll be another 1,000 years, 2,000 years. We don't know when. But it's going to be at the end of 6,000 years.
And then came the state church. AD 312, with the Edict of Toleration, Constantine established the state church and said, okay, Christianity is legal, which sounds wonderful, until you stop and note that now the church was controlled by the state. And JR, this was the 4th century. And then going into the 5th century, a new eschatology was developed.
Yes, and when the church became recognized by the Roman Empire, and it became a Christianized Roman Empire, those ministers patted themselves on the back and says, we've brought in the kingdom.
Yes, indeed.
Now, we don't have the king yet, but maybe he'll come at the end of the millennium, you know. Or maybe there won't be a millennium. We're going to bring the world along and convert everybody because we've got tax money now and we can build great cathedrals. And it was a happy day for the deluded ministers of the 3rd century.
And here's where we're going to have to end our program, because in the 5th century along came Augustine. He wrote City of God. He was an amillennialist, if you will. In Augustinian amillennialism, the present age is regarded as the predicted millennium. The tribulation is said to precede the millennium. It must already be past. And so the troubles of Israel in connection with the day of the Lord are often thought to be past tense. And so Augustine envisioned the ages as follows. Age 1, Adam to Noah. Age 2, Noah to Abraham. Age 3, Abraham to David. Age 4, David to the Babylonian captivity. Age 5, Babylonian captivity to Christ's first advent. Age 6, Christ's advent to his second advent. 6 ages, J.R., and you notice what's left out?
Israel.
Israel. No Israel.
Israel is no longer relevant. The church has taken over all of the chosen people promises, and the church is going to grow and win the world, and then Christ will come back and pat us on the back and say, good job.
Right. Now, we are stopping here at a down point, as we say. I guess we have sunk to low ebb, and I hate to leave it at this because the rest of the story is exciting. I mean really exciting. We've talked about prophecy lost. In our next broadcast, we're going to talk about prophecy found again.
Yes. John Walvoord wrote, Augustinian amillennialism, the present age is regarded as the predicted millennium. But I want you to know it's not. Jesus is coming back, and we have arrived at the end of the 6,000 years, and we can expect the Antichrist to arise soon. We can expect the Jews are back home. We can expect them to restore their kingdom. So don't miss next week's program. This is J.R. Church and Gary Stearman. Until next time, keep looking up.